As soon as the last snow of winter melted, the master builder knew he didn't have much time left to prepare for the next one. Spring, to him, wasn't a gentle beginning. It was the cold tick of a countdown clock. One misjudged day, one measurement even slightly off, could turn into a crack running across an entire wall by December. And when that happened, it wasn't just the building that collapsed. His honor, his fortune, even his life could be on the line if the patron or the local lord decided he was to blame. So the winter plan began the moment the ground softened, while the builders met again and again under a damp roof still wet with morning dew. The master builder had to become a reluctant prophet, predicting how the winds would shift in October, estimating rainfall, calculating how quickly mortar would freeze at each stage, and deciding exactly what had to be finished before the first cold breath slipped between the stones. He reread the notes left by the craftsman before him, records that were more than technical instructions. They were warnings. Walls that had collapsed, crews that had frozen to death, treasuries that had run dry halfway through winter. And in that moment, you realized their spring was never gentle at all. It was the opening battlefield of a race against the cold. As soon as the winter plan was finalized, the entire site moved into what medieval builders called the gathering season, a massive logistical campaign that, if it failed, could freeze the whole project for months and stain the Lord's reputation beyond repair. Thousands of stone blocks were cut from the quarry, numbered, sorted, and hauled back on wooden sleds before the roads turned to mud. Timber had to be harvested at the right moment, from the right trees. Oak for load-bearing frames, pine for scaffolding, and faster-burning woods, like birch, set aside specifically to keep the workers warm during the brutal months ahead. Everything was stacked under temporary shelters, where each beam and each block was guarded from the moisture that could ruin them overnight. Meanwhile, lime, sand, and clay, the materials most vulnerable to damp, were stored in special sheds, with raised floors and controlled airflow, where a single mistake could turn an entire batch of mortar into useless sludge by the time winter arrived. Seen from a distance, the construction site looked less like a workplace and more like a military camp preparing for war. Wagons arriving non-stop, warehouse guards logging every shipment, and the master builder pacing through the yard, checking counts again and again. He knew that if even one stack of timber or a single wagon of sand was missing in December, the entire winter schedule could crumble like a crack running through a wall before it has time to set. Among all the fears medieval builders lived with, nothing haunted them more than the moment they laid the first layer of mortar onto a cold stone in December, only to watch it freeze into ice within seconds. No blizzard was needed, no cutting wind. Just a single breath of cold seeping through the stone was enough to turn fresh mortar into a cloudy sheet of ice, cracking with the sound of breaking glass. "It's cracking! Fire! Bring the fire!" a worker would shout, not out of panic, but because they knew that even a few tiny fractures could bring down a 10-meter wall before dawn. And from that terrifying sight came techniques that today sound almost insane. They built bonfires right at the base of unfinished walls, big enough to warm whole tubs of sand and kettles of water. Sand was shoveled into the mortar while still hot to the touch. Sometimes workers passed steaming buckets hand to hand, sprinting across frozen ground like they were racing time itself. The worst twist, the one modern people rarely believe, is that when temperatures dropped too fast, fresh mortar would literally fog, releasing a thin vapor that crystallized into microscopic ice on the surface, forcing the crew to smash the entire section off and start over. In those moments, you realize they weren't building with stone and mortar at all. They were building with speed, coordination, and the heart-stopping seconds in which they fought the winter for every last degree of warmth. If you've ever seen anything like this, or you're curious how ancient builders fought against freezing walls, drop your thoughts below. Your question might just spark the next chapter of this story. In the skin-cutting cold of winter, when every normal technique failed against the ice sealing itself onto the stone, medieval builders turned to a method that sounds like it came straight out of an alchemist's workshop, mixing quicklime with wet sand right there on the construction site. The moment the lime touched water, the mixture began to tremble almost like a living creature before erupting into a violent wave of heat. The mortar wasn't mortar anymore. It boiled, literally boiled, roaring like a pot of porridge on the fire, sending coils of heat swirling upward into the snowy night. Torchlight flickered across the exploding lime particles, creating a shimmering glow that felt both dangerous and mystical, as if the builders were commanding a material with a soul of its own. But that beauty came with a very real
The north
price.
wall
A
requires another
single,
10
careless
cartloads of
move and
stone by
quicklime would
midday.
spit onto
See
skin,
that it is done.
eating through layers of flesh. The hot vapor rising from the mix could scorch a worker's eyes in an instant. Many wrapped their hands in thick layers of rough
We
cloth,
must finish
but winter
before
always left its
nightfall.
mark. Pale scars, cracked knuckles, deep splits in the skin from working so close to a substance that was half fire, half ice. The wildest twist is that this dangerous reaction was the very key to keeping the walls alive. The sudden burst of heat leapt from the boiling mortar into the frozen stones, letting the binding layer begin to set before the cold could choke it out. On days so cold that water froze solid inside wooden barrels, even the boiling mortar made from quicklime wasn't enough to fight the weather. That was when medieval builders reached for a secret arsenal that modern people would swear was a joke. Animal fat, young beer, fireplace, ash, even extracts from herbs. But to them, this wasn't folklore. This was early antifreeze technology, passed down through generations of stoneworkers. When mixed into the mortar, these organic additives made the mixture more flexible, slower to freeze, and most importantly, better at holding moisture in a way that kept it from cracking when the night frost swept in. Some builders swore that adding a bit of beef tallow helped the mortar slide into the gaps more smoothly. Others believed young beer from the local brewery kept the moisture stable, almost as if the mortar were breathing. Explanations differed, but the result was the same. The mortar gripped cold stone more firmly and resisted the constant freeze-thaw cycles of winter. The most surprising twist is that this winter mortar often lasted longer than the batches made in summer, thanks to the natural elasticity created by those organic additives. Walls built in the cold sometimes stood strong for centuries, a reminder that their survival engineering was anything but primitive. When winter hit so hard that the ground turned into a slab of stone, every shovel became useless. But instead of giving up, medieval builders used a technique that sounds like something out of a legend: waking the earth. They built massive bonfires directly over the area they needed to dig and let them burn for nights on end. At first, the flames warmed only the grass, but hour by hour the heat sank into the frozen soil beneath, turning the ground from a lifeless block of ice into a layer soft enough for a shovel to break through. Sometimes workers sat by the fire all night, listening for a tiny crack from deep underground, the sound that meant the ice was splitting and the earth was breathing again. Under moonlight and drifting white smoke, the scene looked so uncanny that many believed the ground had a soul, and fire was the only way to wake it from its winter sleep. But this method had a darker side. Days of burning could fracture the earth in unpredictable patterns. More than once, a crew would dig for half a day only to have the entire pit collapse, revealing a hidden pocket of hard ice waiting below like a natural trap. Having to pull back, rebuild the fire, and start over pushed the schedule to the breaking point. And each bonfire devoured an enormous amount of timber. Every lost day was a cut straight into the patron's treasury. Even so, waking the earth survived through the centuries as proof of the persistence and ingenuity of medieval builders. If you've heard other stories about strange ancient construction methods, share them below. Your story might be the one that opens the next chapter of this series. As soon as the first winter wind slapped against the stone of the construction site, everyone knew it was time to raise the winter village, a temporary settlement that determined the survival of hundreds of builders. Wooden barracks were packed tightly together to break the wind, their walls stuffed with dry straw and rotting leaves, their roofs buried under thick layers of earth to trap every thread of warmth. But no matter how carefully they prepared, stepping into the village meant stepping into a world where every breath turned into white frost, clinging to beards and hair like tiny needles, where the wind slipping through the cracks sounded disturbingly like a whisper right behind your ear. Inside each barrack, 8 to 12 men slept crowded under one roof, their body heat the only real source of warmth. They lay so close that if one man rolled over, the entire row shifted with him. Anyone who let a wrist or the back of their neck slip outside the wool blanket risked waking up with deep cracks in the skin, bleeding from the cold. Some nights, a young worker would collapse from exhaustion beside the fire. By morning, all anyone could do was wrap him tightly in blankets and pray that the heat would draw him back. Meanwhile, the men working with quicklime returned with raw burning patches on their skin. A single droplet hitting bare flesh in this cold could blister like a flame had licked it. Discipline in the winter village was as strict as in a war camp. Ruining a wall out of carelessness, failing to keep the fires alive, or letting the wood stores get damp could earn harsh punishment because one person's mistake could freeze the entire construction site solid for days. When the cold grew too vicious, cold enough to make mortar crack in their hands and chisels freeze onto the stone, the master builder ordered the entire crew to retreat inside the unfinished halls. And at that moment, the future castle transformed into a winter underground workshop, a place where dozens of trades worked in sync like one massive machine, moving through darkness and clouds of white breath. In rooms without windows, torchlight flickered across raw stone and heavy timber beams, creating an atmosphere that felt more like entering a secret weapons forge than a construction site. In one corner, carpenters fitted oak door frames together. In another, the blacksmith's hammer beat steadily like a heartbeat. Doors, roof frames, support beams, every piece was crafted months ahead of time, waiting for the day the weather warmed so they could be lifted into place. Strangely enough, even in the deadly cold, the work indoors moved faster, more urgently, because they knew that every hour gained was an hour stolen back from winter. In the thick air of torch smoke and pine resin, you could see faces streaked with soot but eyes sharply focused, as if they weren't just building parts of a castle, they were forging its very heart. And it was these hidden winter days, working behind sealed walls, that ensured the castle never truly stood still during the long, frozen season. When winter reached the point where your breath froze midair, the master builder knew the project had entered its life or death moment, protecting the walls before they hardened. One wrong night, just one, and every fresh layer of mortar would crack like shattered pottery. And the patron of the castle, often an ambitious, volatile lord, would not hesitate to unleash his anger on whoever caused the delay. So the ritual of winter wall wrapping was carried out with the gravity of a military ceremony. Layers of straw were pressed tightly against the stone, then covered with thick mats of dry leaves so dense that even whipping winds couldn't pierce them. But the most shocking and most effective layer was the final one. Fresh dung mixed with straw, plastered across the entire surface like a crude, living winter coat. As the dung slowly decomposed, it released a steady warmth, forming a pocket of warm air around the wall, enough to make the damp stone gently steam in 15 degrees Celsius cold. Stand close, and you'd see a thin haze of grayish heat rising from the dung, a sight both eerie and strangely mesmerizing, yet powerful enough to save the entire structure from being crushed by winter. This wasn't just a technique, it was a silent declaration from the castle's master. I have the wealth, manpower, and will to defy nature itself. Walls protected this way became symbols of authority, reminders that whether frost or war, nothing could stand in the way of a ruler determined to see his fortress rise. If you think winter simply slowed the construction down, here comes the final twist. Winter didn't make the castle rest at all. It turned the entire project into a secret machine working in the dark. When the weather warmed again, outsiders suddenly realized that during those frozen months, more than half the fortress had already been prepared, ready to explode into progress the very first day of spring. Timber beams had already been carved, with every joint and notch marked in advance. Door frames, roof frames, railings, and support structures were stacked neatly inside the workshop, waiting for warm sunlight to lift them onto the rising walls. The walls that had been protected under layers of straw, leaves, soil, and dung kept breathing steadily through the cold, almost untouched by damage. And what surprises modern people most is this. The moment the snow melted was the moment productivity erupted twice as fast as in summer, because everything had already been prepared in the darkest days of winter. Winter, long viewed as the enemy of construction, was in truth a strategic season, a time of charging power. Thanks to the persistence, calculation, and sheer boldness of medieval builders, the fortress entered spring not with stagnation, but with a surge. Stronger than any other season of the year, it's proof that people of that era didn't just fight nature, they used nature to conquer time itself. If you have another perspective on how ancient people turned disadvantages into advantages, feel free to share it below. And if you want to keep exploring the hidden engineering secrets behind medieval structures, don't forget to subscribe. The next episode might come from your very comment.